Look at this. A seamless, transparent logo floating right inside the wood. It looks clean and precise.
This is a nightmare. I have a massive leak. Almost 50% of the epoxy resin is gone. It's been about 4 days since the pour and it's still fluid. I don't know what happened.
Getting to this result was absolutely hell. I decided to route this entirely by hand. No CNC, no robots. And cast it with crystal clear epoxy. It was supposed to be a cool experiment, but instead it turned into a nightmare of mistakes, panic and near total failure. And here is how I exactly built this epoxy watch and almost ruined it. Good morning YouTube and welcome back to my channel.
The journey began with a beautiful but slightly twisted walnut slab. I needed to flatten it, but since I couldn't run a warped board directly through the thickness planer, I used the oldest trick in the book. I hot glued the slab to a flat laminated board and used wooden wedges to stabilize it. This creates a slat so the planer doesn't just replicate the warp. Since I wanted to book match two pieces, I cut off the light sapwood on one side with the bandsaw. Then I planed the second face. And here's the good news. I didn't need the laminated jig anymore. Since the first side was already perfectly flat, I could just run it straight through the machine. After that, I went to town with the angle grinder. A carving disc on the grinder made quick work of the remaining sapwood and a chisel took care of the bark. Then it was time for the second board. Thankfully, this one wasn't warped, so it was just a quick plane. I cut it to length on the miter saw, and just like the first piece, I gave the edges a rough treatment with the angle grinder. Now we were ready to lay it out. I marked the best spot for the clock face and prepped for the logo. The plan? A simple template. Then I taped the boards, superglued them to a baseboard and spray glued the printed logo on top. I thought spray glue is the way to go and a smart move. Mistake number 1.
Oh boy, I forgot to sand the edges.
So I had to peel the logo off. And that's when I learned that spray glue really sticks. It was a nightmare to remove. Being a genius, I used spray glue again on the second attempt. I figured I'll just plane it off later. Spoiler alert, I regretted this later on. I finally started excavating the logo. I drilled a few starter holes first, just to give the router a place to enter without burning the wood. Then I used a small DIY guide rail for the Dremel, but the whole thing was wobbly. Worse yet, the soft tape on the bottom stuck to the logo, tearing the paper up as I moved. Suddenly my crisp lines were a fuzzy mess and the paper teared out while routing, so the lines were no longer clearly visible. This is exactly why gluing a paper template directly to the wood is a bad idea. Because of the paper tear out, I ditched the jig and I cut the outline with a knife, which was really awful because of the glue. So I switched to pet mode and freehanded the entire logo with the Dremel. I used a chisel to crisp up the corners. Once all the pockets were cleared, I removed the paper template, cleaned off the sticky mess and prepped for the first pour. To make the mold, I heat bent some plexiglass strips and hot glued them around the wood. I sealed the edges with silicone, using a highly specialized tool. My finger. I mixed the epoxy 2:1, waited for the silicone to skin over and poured. I mean, I used hot glue and silicone. What could possibly go wrong?
Are you kidding me?
Are you kidding me?
Oh, are you kidding me?
Everything could go wrong. It leaked immediately. I panicked, grabbed bad mounting adhesive thinking it would grab fast. It didn't. So I just slapped a massive amount of silicone on the leak and prayed.
24 hours later.
Okay guys, 24 hours have passed and this is a nightmare. I have a massive leak and almost 50% of the epoxy resin is gone. And the epoxy resin is still fluid. I don't know why. Maybe because it's very fresh in here in this room. I try to rescue the project. I will take it apart or something.
And I like my women cinnamon. Chef cooking got a full plate. 24/7 on it all day. The hard way, I'm still on it on an off day. And we can bet it all on.
The nightmare continues. It's been about 4 days since the pour and it's still fluid. I don't know what happened.
3 days later.
Days went by and the resin turned milky white. It also had the consistency of old cooking oil. That was definitely not normal. I had no idea what went wrong. I even emailed the customer support and they also had no idea but sent me a free replacement. I tried to clean the wood with acetone. Wear a mask if you do this, seriously. But it was hopeless. The project was dead. Total reset. New wood, same process.
I gotta keep on moving, yeah. I gotta keep on moving. My mama always told me that I couldn't sit still.
This time I used hard foam for the mold, way better than plexiglass. I also let the silicone cure for hours and not for minutes. Clamped the wood down properly and poured. In the meantime, while the epoxy resin was hardening, I carved the inner fist of the logo. For the fist I used a piece of end grain wood to create a slight contrast to the rest. To do this, I used my Dremel again with the router attachment. 24 hours later. Perfection. No leaks, rock hard. Removing the clog from the mold was a slightly tricky task. You can purchase a specific spray infused with a release agent to help remove hardened epoxy from molds, which, of course, I own, but I didn't use. If you are planning to tackle a resin project yourself, I recommend using a release agent, especially if you are working with larger molds, such as those used for river tables. Disclaimer. Looking back at this footage, I realized what I'm doing here is actually quite dangerous. For your own safety, never chisel towards yourself like I did to prevent getting cut. I built a router sled to act as a thickness planer since the clock was now too wide for my machine. Once flat and all the resin shavings were sucked away, I used a cordless drill to make several holes in the logo, which made it much easier to start milling. Then I switched to the router and carved out the fist in the middle of the clock. For the fine lines and lettering, I went back to using the Dremel. I placed the watch back on the mold board and sealed the edge of the watch again with silicone. Then I glued the end grain fist in the middle with a hot glue gun. Time for the gold. Pro tip. Mix enough resin for the whole pour at once. I did it in batches and, well, let's just say the color match wasn't 100%. Once the gold cured, I flattened the front again, flipped it over and flattened the back. This is where the magic happens. I planed it down until I hit the clear resin from the back, creating this floating effect where the light shines right through the timber. But we had another problem.
Give me a break!
The gold resin on the front didn't fully cure. Probably a mixing ratio error on my part. And because of my batch mixing, there was an ugly color gradient. I had to scrape off the top layer, fill the air bubbles and re-pour the gold fist. I placed the printed template on the workpiece and marked the middle of the watch. Then I drilled the center hole and used it as a pivot point for my circle cutting jig. Slow but steady, this thing looked like a clock. I routed the chamfer on both sides, sanded from 120 up to 400 grit and cleaned it up. To make the frosted sanded resin turn crystal clear again, I did a clear coat. I spread it with my hands and let it self-level. This fills all the micro scratches from sanding. If you plan to try this yourself, please wear gloves. Epoxy resin can be very irritating to the skin. I also used an old soldering iron to burn a dedication on the edge to my Taekwondo Grandmaster. I forgot to film me doing it, but it says like, "Thanks for teaching us."
So it looks pretty good, except of the fist. I don't like how the fist came out, and I also have an air bubble here and some air bubbles here, and I have a golden dot here.
Unfortunately, I'm quite a perfectionist and I wasn't satisfied with the result at all, so I decided to completely route out the edges of the fist and the air pockets again and refill them. I tried injecting resin with a syringe. It didn't work great. I ended up sanding the whole thing down again and doing another clear coat. Once the front was perfect, I cleaned up the cured dips on the back and sanded up to 240 grit. Then I created an overhanging edge with adhesive tape on the front of the clock. The overhang prevented the resin from running over the edge again. Once the resin had fully cured, I removed the tape and cleaned off the residue with brake cleaner. Then I wet sanded the edge by hand, working my way up from 120 to 1500 grit. Finally, I buffed the entire clock using a polishing machine and compound. A clock isn't a clock without hands and a movement. So I widened the center hole a little bit and installed the mechanism as the final step. Now, why did that first batch of resin never cure? It wasn't the temperature, it wasn't the brand. If you look at this shot, you will see two very similar bottles. Well, what can I say? Both bottles contained hardener rather than hardener and resin. So the real problem was me. My original order included 1 resin and 2 hardeners because I still had some resin left over from another project.
Do me a favor, please. Get out of here. Get out of here, man!
Don't be like me, read the label. Although the end result is far from perfect, I am quite satisfied after all the difficulties I had. If you enjoyed watching me suffer, hit like and subscribe. See you in the next one.